a couple of quotes from you here. One from December 2019. You say, I'm going to give my overall credences, 10% to illusionism, 30% to panpsychism, 30% to dualism, and the other 30% to whatever else could be true. You're keeping these as live options, as tenable hypotheses. But one quote from you here, you seem to be against the reductionist account entirely. So, quote from you here in early 2000, no explanation solely in terms of brain processes will be such that we can deduce the existence of consciousness from it. I think that someone could know all the physical facts about the world and still not know about consciousness. Do you reject the idea of a reductionist account coming from physicalism?
Yeah, that's fairly close to the core of my view, which I reject standard forms of physicalism or materialism, just on the grounds that those can't explain consciousness. Maybe certain radical forms of materialism could be correct. Some people see panpsychism as a radical form of materialism. We explain everything in terms of matter. It's just that matter somehow includes a bit of mind at the bottom level. I'm at least open to that. Another radical form of materialism is illusionism, the idea that consciousness is just an illusion, but we can at least explain the illusion in physical form. I'm inclined to think that's wrong and crazy, but nonetheless I find it a very interesting idea, and who's to say that I'm not in the grip of some strange illusions here? So that's why I gave that 10% to that radical form. But the kind of the boring form of materialism, it says, okay, well, yeah, here's the neural correlates of consciousness, and here's a conscious experience, and they're just identical, and so on. I'm inclined to think those don't work. For materialism to work, it's got to be fairly radical. Although, that said, I have to admit, at the end of the day, I'm a philosopher. Most philosophers are wrong about many things, including their central topics. So maybe I'm wrong about all of this. So the last 30%, or maybe there's just stuff I haven't imagined yet. So that last 30% that you quoted, that's just for the possibility that somehow I'm wrong about all of this, or there are going to be amazing new possibilities I haven't thought about. I think, every philosopher has to have a little bit of like higher order humility about this and say, oh, I could be wrong. But that's it. Most of the time, we're just engaged in our first order reasoning, and it seems to me those are roughly the options that get laid out when I go through that first order reasoning.
So our previous guest, Sue Blackmore, in a special illusionist edition in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, writes, quote, "The illusionist research program is clearly worth pursuing. Indeed, it may be the only research program worth pursuing." Could you tell us what illusionism is, David, fully? And to follow up, why do you think philosophers are becoming more attracted to the illusionist research program?
So illusionism is basically the view that consciousness is an illusion, or at least that the problem of consciousness is based on an illusion. It comes in two forms. The strongest form is strong illusionism. Basically says no one is conscious, no one has subjective experience at all. We just think we do. We're in the grip of, brain mechanisms that make us believe we have these special properties of consciousness that nobody really has. In its strongest form, it'll say nobody ever really genuinely felt a pain or experienced dread. Those are just, at least the subjective experience part is just an illusion. Weak illusionism says, okay, maybe people are conscious, maybe they feel pain and they experience dread, but these things don't have all the properties that they intuitively seem to have. So maybe these things seem to be irreducible or primitive or ineffable or some such. And in fact, they don't have those properties. So weak illusionism says that, yeah, maybe we are conscious, but we are very deeply wrong about its nature. So either way, you have introspective illusions. And the connection to the hard problem is that it's meant to be these introspective illusions about consciousness that lead us to believe that there is a hard problem of consciousness. So, Keith Frankish, who's been one of the leaders on illusionism in recent years, says, well, I agree. There really is if there is consciousness, and there really is it's pretty much impossible to accommodate it materialistically. There could be no physical explanation of consciousness, at least as we normally conceive of it. But instead of saying, expand our picture of the physical world, he says, get rid of consciousness. Consciousness is an illusion. The problem for illusionism is it basically seems kind of unbelievable because consciousness seems to be a datum. So that's the enormous problem that any version of strong illusionism has to get past. It seems that they're just denying something completely obvious. But if it can be done, it offers a particularly elegant resolution. I've actually gotten very interested in illusionism through an associated issue I call the meta problem of consciousness. Remember, the hard problem is explaining how it is that physical processes give you subjective experience. The meta problem is the problem of explaining why it seems to us that there is a hard problem of consciousness, and why it seems to us that it's hard to explain consciousness in physical terms. And one thing that's interesting here is that, we distinguish the hard problem, explaining experience, from the easy problems, explaining behaviors. It's arguable there's at least an aspect of the meta problem, which is an easy problem. We go around saying things like, consciousness is very hard to explain. I've already said a million times, there is a hard problem of consciousness. There's a gap there. Well, then you say, why do I say those kinds of things? Those are behaviors. Science ought to be able to explain why we say those things. And maybe I should be open to there being an explanation of that in neurobiological terms. So that's the meta problem. Here's the best argument for illusionism I know. We will eventually be able to explain all the things we say about consciousness in physical terms, including our judgment that we're conscious, that consciousness is irreducible, and so on. If we can explain all those things in physical terms, then we no longer have any reason to believe that there genuinely is inexplicable consciousness. Therefore, you should be an illusionist. And that I find a fascinating argument, and that's why I've got some sympathy for illusionism. I recently wrote a long article on this meta problem and dealing with all these issues. Ultimately, I don't think illusionism works for that basic central reason that it seems to contradict a datum, but it's a fascinating view, and the dialectic is interesting. I say illusionism is unbelievable. You're contradicting data, and they'll say, yes, I can explain exactly why you say that. There's an evolutionary mechanism inside your head that makes you certain that you have this special property of consciousness and makes the truth of illusionism precisely unbelievable to you. So I can explain why you believe that this is unbelievable. That's kind of a cool view.
We'll jump onto the meta problem in a moment. You mentioned earlier, and you said just again there, you've got some interest in illusionism, and you at least think it's something worth pursuing. We had a previous guest, Galen Strawson, and you'll know what he thinks of this, and I'll give it for the listeners here. He calls illusionism the denial. And here's a quote from him from our interview. Illusionism is the silliest view about reality that has ever been held by any human being. And a separate quote from him here. The illusionists sail off the edge of the world in the great ship of fools, crewed by flat earthers under the command of Rear Admiral Daniel Dennett, and we must let them go. This doesn't seem like the type of ship we want to be on at all. I imagine you disagree with Strawson that it's the silliest view ever held by a human being?
My view is the problem of consciousness is hard enough that we should be open to all kinds of radical, crazy-sounding views. To many people, panpsychism, which Galen favors, is a radical, crazy-sounding view. And I certainly see the problems with illusionism, but that said, I think, we need radical ideas. And I think there's a certain subtle elegance to illusionism that Galen has missed. And there's simple denials. Oh, there's no such thing as consciousness. It's nonsense. And that view I find kind of ridiculous. But I think when illusionism is properly developed, it's far more subtle and sophisticated than that. It recognizes the force of these intuitions we have about consciousness. It recognizes they're very strong and hard to resist, and then somehow tries to undermine them and explain them away by giving an explanation of the intuitions themselves. And I think it's a very subtle and interesting move. At the very least, ultimately, maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it still contradicts the data, but I do think of it as, to me, it's one of the few materialist views that actually does take consciousness seriously, because it takes these intuitions so seriously. So I'd much prefer it to, various flat-footed forms of materialism that simply deny consciousness out of hand or simply assert a reductionist thesis.
So you mentioned there a moment ago, David, the meta problem of consciousness, the problem of saying why we think there is a problem of consciousness. But in addition to that, you say, well, look, we have this challenge. And you've kind of written about this in the past, I think, in papers Consciousness and Cognition and in Conscious Mind, Paradox of Phenomenal Judgment. But could you explain to our listeners what the challenge of the meta problem is and why a theory of consciousness needs to at least help explain the meta problem?
Yeah, so the meta problem is the problem of roughly explaining why we say the things we do about consciousness, including everything from reports like, I am conscious, I'm experiencing red, to things like, well, consciousness is very hard to explain. Mary in the black and white room wouldn't know what it's like to see red. These are all things that we say. They're intuitions we assert about consciousness. The meta problem is the problem of explaining those. And whether you're an illusionist or not, the meta problem is an interesting and important problem. It is a fact that we say these things. There ought to be some explanation in some terms. So what I call the meta problem challenge, one way to take it is towards illusionism. Explain those judgments. That's all we have to explain. No such thing as consciousness. But even if you're a realist about consciousness, you think it's real, then I think the meta problem is very relevant. And one way it comes in is through this meta problem challenge. And here the idea is you've got a scientific theory of consciousness. It says such and such is the neural basis or the mechanism of consciousness. The meta problem challenge says basically for a good theory of consciousness, whatever you say is the neural basis of consciousness, that had also better play a pretty central role in explaining the things we say about consciousness. It would just be very surprising if the neural basis of consciousness was independent of all the stuff we say.